Welcome back to Gale Charlie, the channel where we pull back the curtain on the stories the headlines barely touch. If you're new here, I want you to stick around because what we cover goes far deeper than the surface-level news cycle you've already seen 100 times. And if you've been with us for a while, you already know what we're about. Let's get into it. Because what I'm about to walk you through is one of the most staggering geopolitical betrayals in recent memory, not the slow, grinding kind of betrayal that unfolds over years. I'm talking about the kind that happens overnight, the kind where you go to sleep with allies and wake up completely alone, the kind that doesn't just damage a country. It dismantles it from the inside out, piece by piece, system by system, until the entire architecture of survival collapses under its own weight. And the most extraordinary part of this story, the people responsible for that collapse were not enemies. They were the very nations that had signed the alliances, shown up for the summits, shaken hands in front of cameras, and declared themselves brothers against Western dominance: Russia, China, and Iran. For decades, these three nations built what appeared to the world to be an unbreakable axis, a powerful bloc standing as the most credible alternative to Western-led global order. The narrative was polished and consistent: strategic partnership, shared interests, mutual defense, brotherhood. Russia was helping Iran build nuclear reactors. China poured billions into the country through its Belt and Road Initiative, constructing railways, managing ports, running refineries, laying the logistical groundwork for a modern Iran independent of the Western financial system. Iran, in turn, was supplying Moscow with thousands of Shahed drones and ballistic missiles, real weapons used in a real war at real risk to its own national security. Tehran was bleeding for Moscow. The bet was simple: stand by Russia now, and Russia will stand by you when the moment comes. The moment came, and in a single night, the entire alliance, the decades of partnership, the billions of investment, the military cooperation, the carefully maintained illusion of brotherhood, collapsed without warning. Not from a Western missile strike, not from a new round of sanctions, not from a battlefield defeat. It collapsed because Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping gave their people the same quiet, urgent order at roughly the same time: leave. Now, here's exactly how it unfolded, and why the details of this story matter far beyond just Iran. Let's begin with the geography, because understanding where this happened is essential to understanding what it means. Starting from the city of Zanjan, deep in the northwest of Iran, and traveling approximately 300 kilometers due north, you reach the border with Azerbaijan. That corridor became the central artery of one of the most extraordinary evacuations in modern geopolitical history. Iran's airspace had been completely shut down. Warplanes had made commercial flight nearly impossible. A United States naval blockade had sealed the sea routes. That left only two viable land exits for foreigners inside the country: the borders of Turkey and Azerbaijan. And at those borders, something remarkable and deeply troubling was unfolding in real time. The focal point of the exodus was the Astara border gate, a historic crossing point on the Iran-Azerbaijan border. Under ordinary circumstances, Astara is a routine commercial crossing where trucks pass through with cargo and trade flows quietly between the two countries. But between March 1st and March 10th alone, according to field reports from the Azerbaijan-based reporting agency and corroborated by Euronews, nearly 3,000 people from 69 different countries were evacuated through that single crossing. 2,970 individuals from 69 nations in 10 days. Now, if you heard that number in isolation, you might picture frightened tourists or foreign workers trying to get home before things got worse. That's a rational first assumption. But the moment you look at who those people actually were, the story transforms into something far darker than a panicked civilian evacuation. The overwhelming majority were not tourists, not expats or students caught in the wrong country at the wrong time. The demographics of the evacuation told a completely different story. Infrastructure experts managing China's refinery and railway projects across Iran, senior engineers deeply embedded within Russia's energy facilities, Tajik and Pakistani diplomatic personnel. In plain terms, the people walking through that gate were the operational brain trust that had been keeping Iran's critical systems alive and functioning. They knew where every switch was, how every system worked, what every facility needed to keep running, and now they were leaving. The situation along the western axis mirrored what was happening in the north. The Megri crossing on the Armenian border, the Gerbalak and Chapakoy gates into Turkey, all were processing waves of evacuees. Turkey was the preferred transit option for Chinese and Russian officials, stable enough to board international flights home without complications. The evacuation was not panicked or disorganized. It was structured, deliberate, and coordinated at the highest levels of government. This was not a wave of fear. This was a cold-blooded, calculated withdrawal. Let's focus on Russia first, because Moscow's role here is breathtaking in its audacity given the history of the relationship. For months before this moment, Iran had been functioning as a de facto arms supplier to the Russian military. Thousands of Shahed drones, ballistic missiles, real weapons, flowing into a real war at genuine strategic risk to Iran. The logic from Tehran's perspective was straightforward. We prove our loyalty now in the most tangible way possible, and when we need Moscow's backing, it will be there. When the crisis arrived, Russia's response was blacked-out buses through the darkness. According to a March 9th report in the Moscow Times, statements from Rosatom CEO Alexei Likachev revealed the full scope of the operation. 94 senior personnel were airlifted across the border on special government flights. An additional 200 of the remaining 639 Russian citizens were evacuated in those darkened buses during brief windows when the threat of bombardment temporarily decreased. And critically, this was personally authorized by Vladimir Putin himself. Pause on that. The president of Russia personally signed the order to remove his people from Iran, not to send military reinforcements, not to activate air defense systems, not to deliver meaningful intelligence, not to honor a single commitment that decades of alliance rhetoric had implied. The decision from the Kremlin was unambiguous. Pull everyone out and leave Tehran to face whatever was coming alone. The consequences were immediate. The construction of Units 2 and 3 at the Bushehr nuclear power plant, reactors that would have doubled the facility's energy output, projects underway since 2017, came to a sudden and indefinite halt. Russia walked away from a multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade nuclear investment and concluded, without hesitation, that it was no longer worth protecting. But the damage runs deeper than halted construction. The Bushehr plant cannot be operated safely without the expertise Russian engineers had been providing for years. Nuclear energy is not a domain where on-the-job learning is acceptable. The consequences of getting it wrong are measured not in budget overruns but in catastrophic failure. Beyond the safety dimension, the withdrawal carries the realistic potential to trigger a drop of 10 to 15% in Iran's total national energy production. For a country already suffering chronic, widespread power outages, that is not a statistic. It is a lit match near a powder keg. Now let's turn to China, because if Russia's behavior was stunning, Beijing's response was a masterclass in cold-blooded opportunism. The Chinese embassy moved quickly. In the first wave of its emergency plan, 791 critical personnel were evacuated through Azerbaijan. Emergency contingency plans were simultaneously activated for thousands of Chinese nationals still spread across the country. The total number of Chinese citizens in Iran ranged between 5,000 and 9,000. In the context of China's scale, that might seem negligible. That assumption would be catastrophic, because these were not ordinary expats. These were the people who held the keys to Iran's critical infrastructure, literally and figuratively. Refinery technicians who understood the operational specifics of Iranian processing facilities. Operators running digital management systems at deep-water ports. Railway network signaling experts whose departure would paralyze entire logistics corridors. Senior belt and road managers overseeing projects that had transformed Iran's infrastructure for years. When these individuals leave, they don't just leave a physical absence. They take with them institutional knowledge, system access, and specialized expertise that was the only thing keeping those facilities alive. What remains without them? Structurally impressive, but operationally useless steel and concrete. The port situation illustrated this collapse with brutal clarity. The moment Chinese and Russian operators withdrew simultaneously from the ports of Bandar Abbas, Bushehr, and the strategically critical Chabahar, the effect was not gradual, it was instantaneous. Digital automation systems shut down, massive loading cranes froze mid-operation, oil tankers drifted aimlessly in surrounding waters, waiting for instructions that would not come. Export figures did not decline, they went to zero. A nation's entire maritime trade capacity switched off like a light. Iran's economy, already under severe strain from years of international sanctions, was not weakened by this moment. It was destroyed. And here's the first question I want to put to you directly. If Iran's leadership had truly known this is how their allies would behave at the moment of actual crisis, do you believe they would have made the same choices over the last decade? Would Tehran have supplied those drones to Moscow? Would they have built their entire infrastructure dependency around Chinese and Russian expertise? I want your honest answer in the comments, because I genuinely don't think this is a simple question. Now let's pull back to the broader geopolitical dimension, because what I'm about to describe is something most people discussing this story have completely missed. For years, those hundreds of Russian and Chinese experts stationed at Bushehr and across Iran's strategic ports served an unofficial but critically understood function. They were a living deterrent, a human tripwire. When the United States or Israel considered military options against Iranian facilities, one central factor in that calculation was the presence of Russian and Chinese state personnel at those exact targets. Killing those individuals would not have been merely a diplomatic incident. It would have risked dragging Moscow and Beijing into direct military confrontation. That invisible human shield was arguably Iran's most powerful and unique defensive asset, not built with weapons, but with the physical presence of allied foreign nationals. When Putin and Xi issued the evacuation orders, they did not just remove their people. They dismantled that entire deterrent framework in one motion. The facilities are now empty of foreign presence. Strikes that were previously politically catastrophic in their implications became, almost overnight, strategically unencumbered. And then came the economic dimension, the final and most cynically elegant layer of betrayal. As China evacuated its personnel, it simultaneously reduced its oil purchases from Iran by approximately 220,000 barrels per day, settling at 1.03 million barrels daily. For an economy that depends on oil as its primary lifeline, this was not a reduction. It was a surgical cut to a vital artery. Who did China turn to in order to fill that gap? Russia. Beijing boosted its crude oil imports from Moscow to a record 2.07 million barrels per day. While Russia was pulling its engineers out of Iranian facilities in blacked-out buses, it was simultaneously absorbing the market share Iran was losing. Putin was not just protecting his people. He was engineering a situation where Russia benefited directly from Iran's collapse, capturing Tehran's oil customers, filling his war chest, and plugging the economic holes that Western sanctions had carved into Russia's finances, all at the same time, all at Iran's expense. Tehran made one final desperate attempt. Iranian officials offered Beijing a 16% discount on oil, far beyond any global market norm, practically begging, offering to sell at a loss just to keep cash flowing. Beijing declined. The calculation was clear. Iranian oil had transformed from a cheap strategic advantage into a high-risk liability. American sanctions and regional military tensions made Iranian crude genuinely dangerous to transport. Russian oil carried none of those complications. Putin, throughout all of this, maintained public declarations of solidarity with Tehran. The statements kept coming. The rhetoric of brotherhood continued flowing through diplomatic channels. But behind the scenes, Moscow was methodically capturing Iran's lost market share, selling extra oil to China, and using those revenues to offset the economic damage Western sanctions had inflicted on Russia itself. Iran was bleeding out, and its closest ally was quietly filling his own coffers from the wound. Here is the second question, before we reach the conclusion. Do you believe there is a realistic path forward for Iran's government after a collapse of this scale? Or does what we witnessed here represent the point of no return? Tell me where you stand in the comments. This conversation is worth having, because internally, the picture is just as catastrophic. The Iranian population has endured years of hyperinflation spiraling without relief, a national currency collapsing in real time, and international sanctions squeezing every dimension of daily life. The average government worker brings home somewhere between $200 and $300 a month. At that level, filling a family's grocery basket is not routine. It is a genuine act of sacrifice. Food prices are rising. Fuel shortages are spreading through multiplying logistical bottlenecks. Tension on the streets builds with slow, inexorable pressure every single day. But what truly frightens the regime's inner circle is not the unhappiness of ordinary citizens. It is the condition of the Revolutionary Guards, the armed militias, the Basij, the vast security apparatus that functions as the structural skeleton holding the regime upright through every crisis. When China's cash flows dry up and oil revenues collapse, the government faces an equation with no good answers. It cannot pay those forces. And history is not ambiguous on this point. Ideology is powerful. Loyalty can be deep. but a security structure that cannot feed its members and cannot provide for their families will eventually develop fractures. No level of political indoctrination is immune to the pressure of empty pockets and hungry children at home. The greatest threat to the regime's grip on power is not an enemy air campaign. It may be the spreading disillusionment within its own armed forces. The real danger may already be walking through the compound gates every morning. The Tehran administration had invested decades in the belief that it had built something durable enough to withstand Western hostility. The narrative of a multipolar world, of sovereign nations standing together against hegemonic dominance, had been not just foreign policy, but an ideological anchor. And the fatal blow came not from Washington, not from Tel Aviv. It came from the capitals Tehran trusted above all others, Moscow and Beijing. The dream ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet, efficient packing of suitcases at the Astara border gate. The nuclear facilities went silent, the ports froze, the oil sat unsellable, the Allies were gone, and the myth, carefully built and sustained across decades of diplomatic theater, was finished. The great unraveling has officially begun. What this story teaches us, far beyond Iran, far beyond this specific moment, is something diplomats have always known but rarely say out loud. In geopolitics, there are no permanent allies. There are only permanent interests. When the pressure becomes real and the costs become concrete, every alliance reveals what it always was. Not brotherhood, not solidarity, just calculations. Cold, continuous, and deeply self-serving. If that kind of unfiltered, no-filler analysis is what you come here for, and I believe it is, because you're still here at the end, then the best thing you can do right now is subscribe to Gail Charlie and turn on the notification bell. Every video we put out is built to give you the depth and context the headlines simply will not. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. That's genuinely the most powerful way to support what we're building here. And now, I want to hear from you. The comment section is yours, and these questions deserve a real conversation. What do you think this moment means for Iran's future? And do you believe any country truly dependent on a great power can ever trust that alliance when it matters most? Tell me what you think. I'll be reading. Thank you for spending this time with Gail Charlie. Stay sharp, stay curious, and I will see you in the next one.